Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's a privilege to address you today on one of the most defining questions of our time, the shifting balance of global power. For decades, the United States has stood as the unchallenged leader of the international system, shaping economic, political, and military norms. But as we enter a new era marked by the resurgence of Russia and the strategic awakening of nations like Mexico, the foundations of U.S. dominance are no longer as stable as they once appeared. The world is no longer unipolar, it is restless, multipolar, and full of nations demanding a voice in the global order. Let's begin with Russia. Once written off after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow has re-emerged with a fierce determination to reclaim its geopolitical influence. Its actions in Ukraine, its energy diplomacy across Europe, and its deepening alliance with China are not merely acts of defiance. They represent a strategic attempt to rewrite the rules of global power. Russia is saying to the world, we will not live under an American-designed order. This message resonates deeply across parts of Asia, Africa, and even Latin America, where nations are weary of Washington's interventions and eager for a more balanced international system. At the same time, Mexico, America's close neighbor, is redefining its role in the Western Hemisphere. For too long, Mexico was viewed simply as an economic partner in NAFTA or a junior player in North American politics. But under its current leadership, Mexico is asserting a new form of independence. It is building stronger trade and diplomatic ties with China, investing in Latin American cooperation, and taking principled stances on global conflicts, even when they diverge from Washington's line. Mexico's foreign policy today carries a message: we can be a friend to the U.S., but we are not its follower. What's truly fascinating is how both Russia and Mexico, two countries from vastly different regions, are contributing to a broader realignment of global politics. The 21st century is witnessing the end of automatic obedience to U.S. policy. Whether it's through new trade blocs like BRICS, regional partnerships in Latin America, or digital alliances that bypass Washington's control, the world is forming alternative pathways of cooperation. And make no mistake, this is not simply a decline of American power, but a transformation of it. The U.S. still commands enormous economic, technological, and military strength. Yet what's eroding is its ability to dictate terms unilaterally. Power in this new age depends less on coercion and more on cooperation, less on military bases and more on moral credibility. The nations that win the 21st century will be those that build trust, not those that impose fear. If we look closely, we can see this shift in action. Russia's energy diplomacy with Europe, Mexico's trade diversification, China's Belt and Road Initiative, and even smaller nations' assertive voices in the United Nations. All of this points to an undeniable truth. The United States is being challenged not through war, but through strategy. It's a contest of ideas, alliances, and endurance. So, the question before us is not whether U.S. power is ending, but how it is evolving. Will America adapt to a multipolar world by embracing diplomacy, respect, and cooperation? Or will it cling to outdated notions of dominance that isolate it from rising partners? History suggests that true leadership means the ability to listen, not just to command. For much of modern history, the United States has stood as the undisputed leader of the global order, the nation that shaped institutions, set the rules, and defined the meaning of democracy and economic progress. But today, the ground beneath that dominance is shifting. The idea of a unipolar world, where Washington's word was final and its power unchallenged, is steadily fading into history. Around the world, a quiet but undeniable transformation is taking place, and the era of unquestioned American supremacy is being replaced by one defined by competition, cooperation, and resistance. The United States, once the architect of globalization, is now struggling to adapt to the very system it created. This shift didn't happen overnight. It has been decades in the making, shaped by economic missteps, endless wars, and the rise of new powers unwilling to remain in the shadows. The global financial crisis of 2008 was perhaps the first real crack in the foundation, a moment when the world realized that the American-led economic model could falter. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan further eroded global trust, painting an image of a superpower driven more by strategic self-interest than by moral principle. And as the U.S. focused inward, emerging nations began to organize, to trade with each other, to build infrastructure without Washington's blessing. The result is a geopolitical landscape that no longer revolves around a single center of gravity. But what truly makes this moment fascinating is how subtle the change has been. There is no new Cold War, no dramatic collapse, no single event to mark the transition. Instead, it's a gradual diffusion of power, a slow rebalancing that is taking place in every region, from Latin America to Asia to Africa. Countries that once followed U.S. policies are now charting their own paths. They're signing trade deals with China, buying energy from Russia, and forming alliances that bypass traditional Western influence. The message is clear. The world no longer wants to be told what to do. It wants to decide for itself. Even America's closest allies are questioning their long-standing dependencies. Europe, once firmly under the U.S. security umbrella, is now speaking the language of strategic autonomy. In Asia, nations like India are walking a tightrope between cooperation with Washington and partnership with Moscow and Beijing. The Middle East, long shaped by American interventions, is witnessing new alignments. Saudi Arabia and Iran talking peace under China's mediation, Turkey asserting regional dominance, and African nations increasingly looking eastward for investment and development support. At the heart of this transformation lies one simple truth: power is no longer defined by military might alone. In a digital, interconnected age, influence depends on economics, technology, information, and the ability to shape narratives. The United States remains a technological superpower, but its moral and political authority have weakened. Many nations view its promotion of democracy as selective, its use of sanctions as coercive, and its rhetoric about freedom as inconsistent. As Professor Jeffrey Sachs often reminds us, the true measure of leadership in the 21st century is not the number of weapons or bases a nation possesses, but the amount of trust it commands among its global partners. The decline of U.S. unipolarity doesn't mean the decline of America itself, but it does mean the end of an era where decisions made in Washington automatically define the future of the world. The new generation of leaders across continents sees power as something to be shared, not monopolized. And while the United States continues to play a vital role in global affairs, it must now compete on a stage where respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned. This is the age of balance, where strength without credibility is hollow, and influence without humility is fleeting. The unipolar moment was a chapter of history. The multipolar world is the story being written now. The real test for America will not be in how long it can resist this change, but in how wisely it can adapt to it by trading dominance for diplomacy and control for cooperation. Because in the end, global leadership is not a throne to sit upon, it's a trust to uphold. And that trust, today, is being tested like never before. Russia's reemergence on the global stage has become one of the most defining developments in modern geopolitics. Once seen as a fading superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has reasserted itself with remarkable tenacity, reshaping international alignments and challenging the Western order led by the United States. This resurgence is not a sudden burst of defiance, but a carefully calculated strategy rooted in national identity, history, and the relentless pursuit of sovereignty. What makes Russia's comeback so compelling is that it isn't merely military, it's ideological, economic, and deeply psychological. It represents a global pushback against the idea that one nation or one system has the right to dictate the rules for all others. The turning point came when Russia decided to stop playing by the rules of Western diplomacy and started crafting its own. For years, Moscow watched as NATO expanded eastward, as U.S. influence reached into former Soviet territories, and as economic sanctions sought to contain its power. But instead of retreating, Russia began to forge a new playbook, one that combined military assertiveness with strategic alliances, energy leverage, and an increasingly effective information campaign. The message was bold and unmistakable. Russia would no longer be treated as a defeated power. It would be a global player whose interests had to be respected, even feared. Central to this resurgence is energy, the lifeblood of modern economies and the cornerstone of Russia's influence. With vast reserves of oil and gas, Russia has transformed its energy exports into tools of diplomacy. Europe, dependent on Russian gas for decades, learned the hard way that political pressure has economic consequences. Every pipeline, every trade route, every energy deal became a lever of power. Moscow understood that in the modern world, influence is not always about armies sometimes, it's about who controls the switch that keeps the lights on. Even amid sanctions and political isolation, Russia has continued to use its energy dominance to strengthen its ties with nations across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, effectively turning economic pressure into geopolitical opportunity. But Russia's strategy extends far beyond economics. Its deepening partnership with China has become a cornerstone of the emerging multipolar world. While historically wary of each other, Moscow and Beijing have found common ground in their shared opposition to Western dominance. This alliance is not one of friendship, but of mutual interest, a convergence of two powerful nations seeking to build a world where Washington's influence is limited. Joint military exercises, coordinated diplomatic stances, and expanding trade ties are all signals of a new balance of power taking shape. Together, they are crafting an alternative vision of global governance, one that values sovereignty, rejects Western interference, and promotes regional influence as the foundation of global order. Yet, perhaps the most striking element of Russia's comeback is its ability to wield narrative power. Through state media, cultural diplomacy, and cyber influence, Moscow has become adept at shaping global perceptions. It positions itself as the defender of traditional values, a voice for nations tired of Western hypocrisy, and a champion of multipolar fairness. Whether in Africa, Latin America, or parts of the Middle East, this message resonates strongly. It speaks to the frustration of countries that feel exploited by global systems designed in Washington and Brussels. By offering moral resistance to Western narratives, Russia has turned politics into persuasion and persuasion into power. This strategy has not come without cost. Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered unprecedented sanctions and global Beijing's condemnation. Yet, instead of isolation, Moscow found alternative markets and strengthened relationships with non-Western allies. It's a paradox of power. The more the West attempts to contain Russia, the more resilient and creative it becomes. This resilience is not accidental. It stems from a national psyche forged through centuries of struggle, invasion, and reinvention. Russia's leadership has successfully tapped into this collective consciousness, transforming adversity into identity and pressure into purpose. In the grand chessboard of global politics, Russia has repositioned itself as a kingmaker rather than a pawn. It no longer seeks approval from the West, it seeks influence beyond it. Whether through energy diplomacy, military projection, or narrative control, Russia has proven that the post-Cold War dream of US-led global unity was always temporary. It is now rewriting the rules of power and forcing the world to accept that it cannot be ignored. The real question confronting global politics is not whether Russia will endure, but how far it will go in shaping the next chapter of international order. Because in every move Moscow makes, one thing is clear. The era of Western monopoly on power is over. And Russia is determined to make sure the world never forgets it. Mexico's rise as an independent and influential diplomatic actor marks one of the most intriguing political evolutions of the 21st century. Once viewed primarily through the narrow lens of its relationship with the United States, Mexico is now emerging as a voice of balance, pragmatism, and regional leadership. Its transformation from a quiet neighbor to a confident geopolitical player signals a broader shift within the Americas, a shift away from dependency and towards self-determination. The story of Mexico today is not just about foreign policy. It is about identity, sovereignty, and a deep understanding that influence comes not from imitation, but from independence. For much of the modern era, Mexico's political and economic trajectory seemed inextricably tied to Washington. The signing of NAFTA in 1994, later replaced by the USMCA, positioned Mexico as a critical component of the North American supply chain. But it also created a sense that Mexico's global posture would forever be defined by its proximity to the United States. Yet beneath this surface of interdependence, a quiet transformation was taking shape. Over the past decade, Mexico has begun to diversify its alliances, recalibrate its diplomatic approach, and assert a foreign policy grounded in national interest rather than external approval. This shift represents not rebellion, but evolution, the natural progression of a nation that has matured politically and economically to claim its rightful place on the global stage. At the center of this transformation is Mexico's growing confidence in its regional leadership role. It has taken bold stances on issues that once would have required Washington's nod of approval. On matters such as the Venezuelan crisis, migration policies, and global conflicts, Mexico has increasingly chosen neutrality and diplomacy over alignment. It has positioned itself as a mediator rather than a follower, a nation that prefers negotiation to confrontation. This diplomatic balancing act has earned Mexico respect across Latin America and even beyond, as many nations look for examples of how to maintain independence while still engaging with major powers. Economically, Mexico has been equally strategic. While it remains closely tied to U.S. trade, it is actively expanding its relationships with Europe, Asia, and the global South. Its participation in trade agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, shows a clear intent to look eastward for opportunities. Simultaneously, growing cooperation with China in areas such as infrastructure, technology, and investment demonstrates a pragmatic willingness to adapt to global realities. This diversification is not merely about trade, it's about leverage. Mexico understands that economic independence is the foundation of political independence. By building multiple pathways of cooperation, it ensures that no single partner can dictate its future. Yet, perhaps the most profound change lies in Mexico's tone, the way it communicates its role in the world. Under recent administrations, Mexico has embraced a dignified diplomacy that speaks softly but stands firmly. It has resisted the temptation to be drawn into ideological battles and instead focused on practical, people-centered policies. Whether addressing migration, climate change, or inequality, Mexico projects the image of a nation that seeks fairness rather than dominance. This moral clarity has resonated strongly in Latin America, where many nations share Mexico's historical experience of navigating between global powers while striving to preserve sovereignty. This new diplomatic posture also carries a quiet defiance. When Mexico refuses to align automatically with Washington's stance on certain global issues, from conflicts in Eastern Europe to sanctions regimes, it sends a message that partnership does not mean submission. The world is taking note of a Mexico that speaks with its own voice, rooted in realism and respect. It is a subtle but powerful form of influence, one that doesn't rely on military might or economic coercion, but on credibility and principle. There is also a cultural dimension to this emergence. Mexico's soft power through its art, language, cuisine, and global diaspora continues to strengthen its identity abroad. As more nations recognize and celebrate its cultural richness, Mexico's diplomatic influence deepens naturally. It becomes not just a participant in global affairs, but a symbol of resilience, creativity, and authenticity, qualities that are increasingly valued in a world weary of aggressive politics. In an era where smaller nations are often pressured to choose sides, Mexico stands as a reminder that there is power in neutrality, strength in diplomacy, and dignity in independence. Its journey reflects the broader awakening of Latin America, a region ready to define its destiny on its own terms. The Mexico of today is not a shadow of the United States. It is a nation stepping confidently into the light, shaping its policies, building new bridges, and quietly reminding the world that true power is not claimed, it is earned through consistency, respect, and vision. The rise of regional cooperation blocs marks a profound transformation in the architecture of global politics. For much of the post-World War II era, international relations revolved around Western-led institutions, the United Nations, NATO, the World Bank, and the IMF, all of which reflected, to varying degrees, the priorities and interests of the United States and its allies. But in the 21st century, a quiet but powerful rebellion has begun to unfold. Across continents, nations are coming together to form new alliances, trade networks, and development partnerships designed to protect their autonomy and amplify their collective voice. These regional blocs are not just about economics or diplomacy. They represent a reawakening, a movement to reclaim agency in a world long dominated by a single narrative. At the heart of this shift lies the idea of shared strength. Countries that once struggled individually against the weight of Western influence are now finding power in unity. The BRICS alliance, originally composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is a prime example. What began as a loose economic forum has evolved into a formidable geopolitical force, challenging the hegemony of Western-led institutions. With recent expansions to include nations like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt, BRICS now represents not just a collection of emerging economies, but a coalition with the capacity to redefine trade, finance, and global governance. Its calls for a multipolar world and alternatives to the U.S. dollar-dominated financial system have resonated strongly in the global South, where economic dependency on Western systems has long been a source of vulnerability. Latin America, too, is witnessing a similar awakening. Through organizations like CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, regional leaders are pushing for greater political coordination and independence from Washington's influence. Once fragmented by ideology and competition, the region is now finding common ground in shared goals: fair trade, sustainable development, and respect for sovereignty. For decades, Latin America was seen as the United States' geopolitical backyard. Today, it's becoming a laboratory of autonomy, a region determined to shape its own future, rather than have it dictated from afar. This movement toward solidarity reflects a collective understanding that cooperation, not competition, is the pathway to true strength. In Africa, the African Union and regional bodies like ECOWAS are stepping into roles once dominated by external powers. African nations are increasingly engaging in intracontinental trade, infrastructure development, and joint security initiatives. They are recognizing that their collective bargaining power on the world stage is vastly stronger when they act as a unified bloc rather than as isolated states. The recent establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, stands as a historic milestone, the world's largest free trade zone by number of countries, symbolizing Africa's determination to rely less on Western aid and more on regional self-sufficiency. Asia, meanwhile, continues to be the epicenter of new regional dynamics. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has become a model of pragmatic diplomacy, balancing relationships between competing global powers while maintaining its own strategic cohesion. By engaging with China, the United States, and India on equal terms, ASEAN has demonstrated that small and medium-sized nations can navigate global complexities without becoming pawns in great power rivalries. Similarly, China's Belt and Road Initiative, while controversial, has connected dozens of countries through infrastructure and trade, reshaping regional economics and altering global routes of commerce and influence. What ties all these movements together is a shared determination to resist dependency and build structures that reflect the realities of the modern world. These regional blocs are not anti-Western by design. Rather, they are pro-sovereignty, a collective assertion that no single power should dominate global affairs. They seek fairness in trade, inclusivity in diplomacy, and respect in partnership. Their growing influence is forcing traditional powers to rethink the language of international cooperation, where aid is no longer charity but mutual benefit, and where decisions are made through consensus rather than coercion. Behind the formation of these blocs is also a philosophical shift, a rejection of the belief that globalization must flow through Western channels. Instead, countries are crafting new definitions of globalization, regionalized, culturally attuned, and driven by shared development goals. This is a quieter, more organic form of integration, one that values sovereignty as much as collaboration. The rise of these regional entities is sending a powerful message. The world is ready to move beyond dependence and toward a future built on partnership. The new global order is not being declared from podiums in Washington or Brussels, it's being negotiated in the capitals of the global South, where unity is finally replacing isolation and cooperation is emerging as the truest form of power. The United States today stands at a crossroads of perception and power. While it remains unmatched in military strength and technological innovation, its credibility, the invisible currency that sustains global leadership, is under unprecedented strain. The challenge is not that America has lost its capabilities, but that it has lost the world's confidence in how those capabilities are used. From wars fought in the name of democracy to sanctions imposed in the name of freedom, the U.S. finds itself questioned not only by adversaries but also by long-standing allies. The image of a nation once seen as the guardian of liberty is being replaced by that of an inconsistent power, often driven more by self-interest than by shared principles. The erosion of moral authority is not a sudden event. It is the result of decades of contradictions between rhetoric and reality. The decline in global credibility can be traced through a series of choices that have blurred the moral clarity of American leadership. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction that never materialized, marked a turning point. It was a moment when much of the world began to question whether the U.S. acted out of genuine security concerns or geopolitical ambition. The consequences of that war, regional instability, humanitarian crises, and a generation's worth of distrust, still linger today. Similarly, the prolonged conflict in Afghanistan ended not in victory, but in exhaustion and disillusionment. When American troops withdrew in 2021, leaving behind chaos and uncertainty, it symbolized the end of an era of interventionist confidence. For many nations, these episodes were not just foreign policy missteps, they were revelations of inconsistency, exposing the gap between American ideals and actions. Yet, the credibility problem extends beyond the battlefield. It seeps into trade, diplomacy, and human rights. Washington's use of economic sanctions, often justified as tools of justice, is increasingly perceived as political coercion. Countries under sanction regimes, from Iran to Venezuela, have learned to adapt, turning to alternative financial systems and regional partnerships. The unintended result is a world gradually decoupling from the U.S.-led economic order. Meanwhile, when America lectures others on democracy, while struggling with its own domestic polarization, social unrest, and political gridlock, the message loses force. The power of example, once the cornerstone of U.S. influence, has been replaced by the optics of hypocrisy. Allies, too, are recalibrating their relationships. Europe, historically dependent on the U.S. for security and leadership, is increasingly exploring strategic autonomy, a polite way of saying it can no longer rely solely on Washington. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the unpredictability of trade policies, and shifting commitments under different administrations have left allies uncertain about America's constancy. In Asia, nations like India and Indonesia are maintaining pragmatic distance, cooperating with the U.S., where interests align, but refusing to be drawn into its geopolitical rivalries. Even within the Western alliance, there is a growing awareness that American leadership, once unquestioned, must now be verified through action rather than assumed by tradition. The struggle for credibility is also unfolding in the digital and information age, where power is measured not only by weapons or wealth, but by trust. The rise of global social media platforms has exposed inconsistencies that once went unnoticed. Civilian casualties, covert operations, and economic interventions are no longer confined to classified documents. They are broadcast, analyzed, and debated in real time. The narrative control that once allowed Washington to define its image has eroded. Competing voices from Moscow, Beijing, and even within its own society now challenge every claim and expose every contradiction. The United States, once the master storyteller of global order, is finding it harder to persuade an audience that has grown skeptical. But credibility is not lost through failure alone. It's lost through the refusal to acknowledge failure. The world no longer expects perfection, but it does expect honesty. Nations that can admit mistakes, recalibrate, and act transparently tend to regain respect. Those that deny, deflect, or double down tend to lose it. The tragedy of America's credibility crisis is that it still possesses immense potential for good innovation, culture, education, and diplomacy, yet its power is often diluted by the arrogance of moral superiority. The greatest leaders in history have understood that influence is sustained not through dominance but through example. The hook of this moment is that the U.S. is being watched more closely than ever, not for its military might, but for its integrity. Every decision, every statement, every contradiction ripples across a world hungry for fairness and stability. In this environment, the true test of power is persuasion without force, authority without arrogance, and leadership without pretense. America's challenge is no longer about defeating enemies but convincing friends. And until it can rebuild that trust through consistency, humility, and genuine respect, its global strength will remain impressive in form, but fragile in faith. The world is entering a decisive era, one defined not by the dominance of a single superpower, but by the delicate balance of many. The transition toward multipolar diplomacy has become the central drama of our time, reshaping global relationships and redefining the nature of power itself. The unipolar world that emerged after the Cold War, where the United States stood unchallenged, is now giving way to a more complex and competitive order. This is not chaos, it is evolution, a natural correction in the flow of global influence. What we are witnessing is the end of command politics and the birth of cooperative pragmatism, where alliances are fluid, interests are shared, and diplomacy replaces domination as the true measure of leadership. In this evolving system, countries like Russia, China, India, and Mexico are no longer mere participants in the US-led world order. They are co-authors of a new script. Each, in its own way, is contributing to the dismantling of old hierarchies and the construction of new partnerships built on mutual benefit. This new era of diplomacy doesn't ask who leads, but how nations can coexist. It's a world where power is negotiated rather than imposed, where dialogue replaces dictate, and where national sovereignty becomes the currency of respect. The essence of multipolarity lies not in rivalry but in recognition, the recognition that no single state can or should shape the destiny of all others. The United States, long accustomed to setting the terms of engagement, is learning that influence must now be earned through cooperation. Gone are the days when American approval alone could define legitimacy. Countries are turning toward multilateral institutions and regional blocs that reflect their interests more accurately. Organizations like BRICS, ASEAN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and CELAC. These alliances are not born out of hostility toward Washington, but from the desire for balance. The new diplomatic landscape is no longer about choosing sides. It's about creating space, political, economic, and cultural, where different powers can operate simultaneously without subjugation. One of the most striking features of this transition is how soft power and strategic diplomacy are overtaking military dominance as the tools of influence. Nations are realizing that building trust, offering fair trade, and respecting cultural diversity yield longer-lasting partnerships than coercion or conflict. Countries like India have mastered this balancing act, engaging with the US, Russia, and China all at once, proving that independence in foreign policy is not weakness, but wisdom. Similarly, middle powers such as Turkey, Brazil, and South Africa are expanding their global influence by acting as mediators rather than followers, carving out unique roles in peace negotiations, trade facilitation, and regional stability. Multipolar diplomacy also represents a moral realignment in global politics. The traditional justification of interventionism in the name of democracy or human rights is being replaced by the principle of mutual respect. Nations are demanding equality and dialogue, not lectures. The world's emerging consensus is that peace cannot be exported and governance cannot be imposed. Instead, the success of any global system depends on understanding local realities and empowering nations to build their own paths toward progress. This shift is creating a more authentic form of internationalism, one rooted in empathy, diversity, and collaboration. Yet this transition is not without tension. The old order does not yield easily, and the new one is still taking shape. Competing visions of power often collide, sometimes economically, sometimes militarily, and sometimes through information warfare. But even within these conflicts lies a deeper truth. The monopoly on global leadership has ended. The voices of once silent regions, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, are growing louder, demanding representation, fairness, and inclusion in global decision-making. This widening chorus of perspectives is not fragmentation, it's democratization on a planetary scale. The hook of this moment is unmistakable. The world's stability now depends on diplomacy, not dominance. Cooperation has become the new competition. Nations that once viewed one another through the lens of rivalry are learning to coexist through necessity. Energy, security, climate change, migration, and technology have bound humanity together in ways that transcend borders and ideologies. No nation, no matter how powerful, can solve these challenges alone. The 21st century's defining skill will not be the ability to command, but the capacity to collaborate. In this new age, power flows differently. It circulates rather than concentrates. The United States, Europe, and other established powers are being invited, not replaced, in this reimagined world order. The real test for them will be whether they can adapt to a system built not on dominance, but on dialogue. The multipolar world is not a threat to stability. It is its safeguard. It is the world learning to breathe collectively again after decades of control. And in that breath lies both the uncertainty and the promise of our shared future, a future where the strength of nations will be measured not by how loudly they command, but by how effectively they listen. In conclusion, we are living in a time of historic transformation. The world is not collapsing, it is rebalancing. Russia's assertiveness and Mexico's independence are not threats, they are signs that global politics is maturing beyond the shadow of any single power. The challenge for the United States is to recognize that being a global leader in the 21st century no longer means standing above others, it means standing with them. As Professor Jeffrey Sachs often reminds us, the future of peace and prosperity lies not in domination, but in cooperation. The question now is, will Washington hear that call before the world moves on without it?